Hello and welcome. I'm
Hi.
Hi, Sarah. My name is Jenni Doering. I'm a producer at Living on Earth and the host of tonight's event. We're so glad that you all could join us for this virtual event. Living on Earth is a public radio show and podcast that airs across the country. We cover news on ecology, human health, and of course, climate change, which is the focus of tonight's event. This event is part of our ongoing Good Reads on Earth series, where we interview authors about their latest work. Thanks so much to our co-sponsors, the UMass Boston School for the Environment and the UMass Boston McCormick Graduate School. Of course, we hope you stay with us after this event. If you'd like to listen to our program, Living on Earth can be found on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and other streaming services. And you can find out how to tune in through the radio station nearest you by visiting our website, loe.org. So for tonight's Good Reads on Earth event, we're so excited to welcome Sarah Jaquette Ray. She's the author of this book, A Field Guide to Climate Anxiety: How to Keep Your Cool on a Warming Planet. Sarah teaches environmental studies at Humboldt State University in Arcata, California. If you have questions for Sarah during this event, please send them to us by commenting on Facebook Live or on the Zoom webinar, wherever you're watching this from, and we will save time for your questions at the end. So without further ado, Sarah, welcome to Living on Earth.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm so honored to be invited.
So just before we jump into the book itself, given the times that we're all living through, I wanted to ask you, how are you doing today, Sarah?
Yeah, I think today was a little bit of a rough day, and I woke up with all of those negative feelings that niggle at us, and we're sort of living in somebody was describing it as coronavirus whiplash or something, where you kind of go back and forth between sort of being able to pretend things are normal, and then all of a sudden you remember and you come waking up to it again. And that was this morning for me, and I had to sit down and write down the lists of some of the things I was going to do to take care of myself today, that I've been drawing on more and more in this reality than I ever thought. Even with climate anxiety, which you think having written a book on it, that I would be using these things all the time. No, not at all. I just wrote the book, in case I needed it one day. But of course, now it's really a time for needing it. So.
Yeah, well, I mean, it couldn't have come at a better time. So, of course, you started planning this book long ago, but what inspired you to write this book, A Field Guide to Climate Anxiety?
Yeah, so just to sort of just quickly point out the comment you just made about coming at the right time. It's so interesting you should say that, because of course the book came out on Earth Day, April 22nd, I guess it was, this year, in the middle of the sort of beginning of the really strong move towards locking down and shutting down around coronavirus. And I remember thinking, well, this is really sad, because I had these book events scheduled that I had to cancel all these things. And I thought, oh, this is like the book I'm going to write in my life that matters the most to me. And now it's going to be overshadowed by coronavirus. And that was my initial thought. But very quickly, interesting you should say it come at the right time. Really quickly, it became obvious to me that coronavirus anxiety is climate anxiety, and that's sort of the point. And there's a section in the book where I say that people will only really begin to care about climate anxiety on a mass level if it's reframed through the lens of health and public health. And here we are. And of course, there's science to show that the increase of pandemics and increase of infectious diseases will be one of the results of climate change and sort of human intrusion into nature. And so it is a funny thing that you should say that. So I appreciate that you said that. So what inspired me to write this book was that I was myself, I'm sort of hyper empathetic and for my students. And one of the reasons why I love to teach. And as a college professor and leading environmental studies programs for the past 10 years, I had noticed that over the last 4 or 5 years or so, students were increasingly getting more and more existentially wrought over these issues. And when I say these issues, I don't even mean climate change. At that point, it was mostly just things like environmental injustice and the extent to which humans have affected the environment. And we think about the Anthropocene as a geologic age defined by human impact on the environment. There's no untouched nature anymore. Sort of all of these realities sinking in the college level, and a lot of the challenges to the things that they had learned themselves growing up
It's
We're all
totally
learning.
overwhelming.
It's overwhelming, and
Yeah.
increasingly young people are feeling the effects of climate change too. They're no longer, it's no longer a distant thing that's happening only to polar bears or something. It's really happening, and they're reframing it as the fires that I'm experiencing, or the rising sea levels I'm experiencing, or the increased heat where I'm experiencing. All of a sudden, the dots are getting connected to climate change, and they're no longer thinking of it as something that's going to happen 100 years from now or 200 years from now, but really in their lifetimes. And I think that the despair and anxiety around that was starting to be overwhelming to me as well. I had sort of been able to put those things in a cupboard and ignore it and just get on with my life, and have children and go on being a professor of environmental studies, when I realized that the tools I was going to need for myself and for students were really going to be something other than what I had been trained in during my PhD. And so I actually had a really kind of watershed moment with one of my colleagues, Jennifer Ladino, and she said to me, "Well, the worry that you have about your students and the amount of existential caregiving that you're giving to your students to get through this material, that shouldn't take you away from your research agenda." Because I was complaining to her that I was not able to do any research because I was just taking care of students all the time. She said, "Why don't you turn that into your research?" And I thought that was brilliant. I thought that will be helpful for me. That'll be helpful hopefully for my students. That will be helpful for other people. And this would be the solution, right? But then also what inspired me too is that in the 2000 after the 2016 U.S. presidential election, there was a sense of among academics who worry about environmental issues and especially environmental justice issues, that things were going to get much worse before they could get better. And it was a real dampening on hope. And I realized that as an academic, I needed to write a more public facing book. I needed to be more accountable to what academia can offer the public and to democracy. And so I really felt a strong kind of ethical and political drive to write something that wasn't just going to collect dust on the shelf for my narrow scholarly audience. So those are the kind of two main reasons.
Yeah, that's really interesting that you're talking about this as, a much more public facing project than maybe you initially, intended. But certainly you say that, educators, the way that they talk about climate disruption needs to change. Or at least you have some advice to give them in terms of how they can approach it in a little bit better way to help their students with this issue. So can you talk a little bit about that advice that you have for your fellow academics?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because I think environmental studies and sciences, or the sort of broad big tent field of environmental studies and sciences, we often are trained exactly not to be emotionally attentive to students. And many students even go into the environmental fields because they kind of want to, maybe implicitly or they have an unacknowledged sort of desire to get away from the messiness of human life and human emotion. And so the complexity and messiness of society and human life and the things that they find egregious about society, environmental studies seems to offer some kind of balm for, right? Like you can go and study the environment and you can spend a lot of time in nature and you don't have to deal with all that stuff. And so I think in some ways, environmental folks are uniquely ill-equipped to deal with emotional dimensions of what they study. But of course, in recent times, there has been some really great research from folks like Ashley Consolo and Susan Clayton, who have documented the emotional impacts on scientists in particular who have been recording these losses and extinctions and problems. And so you really get the first kind of canary in the coal mine effect from the scientists themselves having severe depression and anxiety about what's happening, what they're seeing. And so that's one place where we can sort of start to think, hey, even we know that the scientists themselves are really struggling with this. Also, there's the training in environmental studies, at least that I received, and I think many people in my generation received, was that the point of what the way you were going to teach was you were just going to sort of overwhelm students with how bad things were, and then just assume that education would let them figure out how to deal with it, and that would motivate them, right? Sort of bombard them with how bad it is, and then assume that will trigger action from them, and that they will go off into the world and become wonderful advocates. And that may have been the case, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, but increasingly that's not the case. And young people are actually coming into college level and even high school level really pretty aware of what's happening and how bad it is. And the doom and gloom has already seeped into their generation. And so my advice for educators is to assume that they're already there and that more bombarding is actually going to backfire, and it can turn students off. It can turn young people off to thinking that they can do anything, because the bombarding, it turns out, has the effect of making students and young people feel like they can't do anything to fix it. And once you have that sense of inefficacy, you're not likely to engage anymore. And so this is where my research on all the sort of psychology aspect of these messages really translated into the book, right? What are the emotional states that people need to be in order to engage for the long term in this kind of work? And so it turns out apathy, despair, and nihilism may work for short-term behavior change, and fear and guilt may prompt some behavior change, some short-term behavior change. Guilt has been kind of the affect du jour of mainstream environmentalism, right? But it turns out that they don't have the long-term effects that we want from people, and it's not going to attract. It is less likely to attract more people to the cause. And so my argument for environmental educators is we need to be more accountable to the research on the psychology of what it is that the messages that we're giving is doing to young people, and to assume that if we want them to be actors in the world for the long term, that we need to give them emotional outcomes as much as we need to give them content outcomes. And we need to engage that research on what those emotional outcomes ought to be.
Mm. Now, it's of course important that you're writing this field guide is for everybody, but especially for Generation Z, you're right. So why is it important to you to make Gen Z the focus of this book in particular? You know, these students that are coming in that you're seeing with this sense of doom and gloom.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of reasons. One, the main reason is that they have some unique demographic qualities that we get kind of lost or missed if we don't pay attention to them uniquely. And of course, anytime you put boundaries around a generation, there's always arguments to say that this is silly, or that, the exceptions are as important as the rule. But the rule in general for Generation Z is that they paint a really interesting picture of what's going to happen when they start taking over leadership roles and start being the educators and being the politicians and being the activists. And they already certainly are. I mean, they've led the climate strikes, and they're leading the protests around George Floyd and Black Lives Matter movements right now. So the youth really they're tapped into the positive parts of this generation that we really want to hold up, are that they're tapped into the intersection between racial justice issues and climate and environmental issues in a way that previous generations of environmental folks have not been, or that they've had to it's taken a while for them to come around to that. The youth that I'm speaking to in this book are more ethnically diverse than any generation in US history. They're the largest generation ever in U.S. history, and they also are seeing these intersections between environmental and social justice, as I mentioned, which there's research on this, which I find is really exciting about this generation. Of course, the sort of downside is that they're also the most lonely, suicidal, and depressed generation and anxious generation that we've ever had. They're also going to have the highest student debt if they go to college. They're the least likely to be as well off as any of their parents of any generation, and they're also going to be likely to live less long. And so there's some really unique demographic aspects to this generation that I think makes them worthy of their own book, right? Their own focus. And also, when we see the youth movements taking charge, it looks really different to me than anything that I ever did when I was young. Everything was really, I had a real sense of not being able to make any difference in the world. And there was no point in even trying, because once you got locked behind one ideology, you'd realize that was wrong. There's too much gray area, and the politics were too gray. And I think this generation sees politics pretty clearly, that there's sort of a right side to be on climate change and climate justice. And they're leading the way on the content, on the analysis of power with this stuff, with the organization, with the social media organizing. So people who aren't in this generation have a lot to learn from these folks. And I just really feel like the sort of emotional wisdom aspects of what I had researched is where they might use some help, right? There's some learning about how emotions work in the neuroscience of emotions, right? Learning how windows of tolerance work, learning how your prefrontal cortex, when it fully develops, what it could be capable of doing. This kind of stuff was just super no one had ever trained me in emotional intelligence or this kind of what I call climate wisdom in the book. And that's really where I felt like I've had the greatest impact on my students and the role that I've had with my students. And so I realized, well, that seems even more important than this other stuff I had been taught to teach. And so they're really my muse, right? They're my antidote to despair myself, because they are super flexible and adaptable and eager to have fun with this. And they want to do all this work, but they want to be fun and pleasurable. And they're teaching me about that. They want to eat good food along the way. They want to be good and take care of other people. I mean, it's just, they're so inspiring. And so I think, casting a light on them in this way to amplify the work that they're doing is one of the ways that we can really feel hopeful about what the future holds.
Well, we'll get to hope in a little bit. But, it sounds like you're saying that Gen Z and other young activists, they just need a nudge. They need a little bit of help. They're facing a lot of challenges around, being able to organize right now with, the rates of depression that you mentioned. But there's also a more urgent need than ever. So let's talk about some of these strategies that you bring up in your book to help people cope with climate anxiety. I know you offer several strategies, but I wonder if you could highlight a few of the most important big takeaways and kind of like the themes that you have in this book.
That's my favorite question. But of course, I'm always like, well, just read the whole book. It's all in there. But I'll do the 3 or so that I think are the ones that seem to have landed well with my students and the folks who I talk to about this. One of them is that environmentalism as a movement has generally been a movement that has emphasized scarcity and deprivation and guilt and these kinds of feelings, right? And so I really am really strongly arguing in this book that environmentalism needs to be reframed, and we can take the lead again from young people as a movement of abundance and pleasure and desire and imagining the imagination of what the world could possibly be like if we wanted to manifest it and make it.
So just to pause there for a sec, pleasure and desire, these were things I did not know could be associated with like the environmental movement before reading this book. So can you explain, what does that mean?
Yeah, so I think less stick, more carrot, right? There's this sort of, we know how dopamine works in the human brain, and people come back, and not just people, but all kinds of animals will keep coming back when there's pleasure associated with things. And so that's not necessarily, I'm not saying all things pleasurable, just partake, right? I mean, cornucopia, but that environmentalism ought to use pleasure really strategically around how it is that we manifest the worlds that we want. And so instead of operating from a place of, look at this awful world that's unfolding ahead of us, let us take as our motivation for action fear of this potential world that's about to happen. Instead, right? So that's the world we're operating in right now, really intensely. And environmentalists have been operating in that world for a long time, right? So this is not a new trope for environmentalism. But I'm suggesting, taking the cue from young people, that we ought to be thinking about a world that's unfolding and turning into something much better, and that the old ways of doing things that we take for granted and we think are unstoppable, are immovable, are in fact quite remakeable, right? This, the Ursula Le Guin wonderful quote about, we thought feudalism and slavery and capitalism and all these things are fixtures of society that we can't be changed, but they always are changed, right? And history has shows us that these seemingly static things are changeable. And so young people thinking about a future that they desire and imagining that every single day that they are crafting and moving step by step in small ways towards this future, even if all it is creating that world in their immediate scale around them, is an extremely empowering argument to make. And it also taps right into pleasure and desire. They're thinking about the world they want, and they're making it right in front of them, even if it's in tiny little ways, right? Because then that scales out and it has a kind of contagion, a social contagion to it. And that's what I notice with my students, right? All of a sudden, and this kind of segues into my second main takeaway. Mm-hmm. When I realized that my students were not just individual bodies in there, and that I had individual relationships with them, and that they were going to all walk across the stage kind of individually when they graduated, and all this was the way I kind of thought about college, that in fact, the biggest outcome that they could have would be to have a community with each other and across cohorts, and to see each other as a lab for the world that they're trying to build outside of college, that this is really this is the practice right now. It changed everything about the way I teach. It's still changing everything about the way I teach. And it's been ongoing unfolding. The critique of individualism that has to happen to open up that space for pleasure and desire, because everybody thinks that they can't fix the hugeness of the problems all by themselves. And they often burn out working really, really hard under that pretense. And ultimately by 22 or 23, I see so many students walk through my door who just look, ghastly because they're just about to be on the edge of burnout. And I think that that's, if we can fuel ourselves and resource ourselves by thinking that what we're doing is creating the world we want rather than running away from the world we fear, that will have the effect of resourcing us rather than depleting us. And I've really had to think that way about my life in a new way since I really wrote that in the book. I thought, I need to do that. So that the critique of individualism that comes along with that is kind of my second point.
And on that note of community, actually, I'm curious to see, because I was involved in climate activism as a student in college, and that was one of the most important things, certainly about my college experience at Whitman and Walla Walla, Washington. But I mean, have you seen changes in the students as you've been putting these strategies into practice? Have you seen changes in the ways that they've been organizing themselves and going about divestment or whatever they want to take on as students?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the key things there is, and this would be the third point, which is to resist burnout. And I think a lot of young people sort of maybe wear their exhaustion and their burnout as kind of a badge of credibility, that this is the way that they're showing that they are invested enough and that they are sacrificing. If they're sacrificing, that must mean that they are, credibly engaged. And I think one of the things I have students do, one of the exercises is we read this book by Adrienne Maree Brown called Emergent Strategy. And in Emergent Strategy, Adrienne Maree Brown talks a lot about misery resistance, having a practice of misery resistance. And her second book is called Pleasure Activism. And so there's a sense of, hey, what would happen if we saw, and another argument she makes is less critical connection more than critical mass. And instead of waiting around for enough people to care about it, build a community that you have right around you and make the connection be what's valuable, what's going to make the change happen. And so when students start to internalize things like the critique of individualism, that burnout is not a badge of honor, that the planet needs you to not burn out, right? That resourcing yourself and feeling pleasure is part of the way you're going to keep doing this work and also share the love of this work with other people, then they take that into the stuff that they're doing. And for example, when my seniors capstone class this semester had to quit their service learning projects all around the community because of COVID, they all gave up what they were doing and joined the local mutual aid organizations, right? So there was a sense of, hey, this is what we were trained to do. We know exactly what we need to do. We're not going to go sit in our dorms and our apartments and feel sorry for ourselves. This is the community we want to build. This is the opportunity. This is what we've been kind of waiting for, right? The impulse to really push on building community and practicing what we're learning in college. And so, yes, I've noticed a difference. And the other thing I've noticed that's so different is that they really see that humanity and people and human connections are going to be the way to get where we need to go with the environment, rather than seeing humanity and human relationships as an impediment to that, right? This sort of annoying thing that has to happen along the way. And so there's a real turn against misanthropy, right? This kind of hatred of humans that may have characterized environmentalism in different generation is not the way I see young people organizing.
Wow. Oh, that's amazing to hear about that. They just immediately, they were like, we know what we need to do.
Right. Well, then I realized that's why we've been teaching this stuff. Thank goodness.
Yeah.
I mean, many of them suffered a lot. I mean, many of them are still suffering, but they found many of them found that their consolation or the solace that they could have in the suffering was in these communities, and they were primed to do it.
Yes, and it sounds like, so a lot of what you're talking about is inspired by other social movements. And I mean, Adrienne Maree Brown, she's a Black feminist, right? And writes about that kind of liberation. So what can we learn from other social movements about the importance of, addressing our fears and anxieties, and resisting burnout, and everything that you're discussing.
Yeah, and I think that's a great question, because one of the things that frustrates me about the environmental movement is it seems to have amnesia about the fact that other social movements have struggled before and that there's been despair in other movements. And so I'm really thinking here of the work of folks like Kyle Powys-White, who's a Potawatomi indigenous climate activist and a scholar and philosopher. And he argues really against the trope of urgency around environmental disruption, and if we sit in the space of urgency and fear and anxiety about, gripped by the reality of what's happening, it has bad effects on us, sure, but it also has the effect of ignoring how many other social movements have felt the same way about environmental disruption. Colonialism is a 400-year-long form of environmental disruption and emergency. So there's a sense of, okay, maybe we should look to other social movements. The environmental movement, which has predominantly been kind of a white privilege movement, needs to start to think about things like resilience and survivance and all kinds of different strategies around how it is that in the face of what seems like impossible odds, you still need to get up in the morning and do the work. And I think that one of the things that they can learn from that is intergenerational support. So going back to community, thinking about multiple generations having gone through this, what are the strategies of resilience of my grandparents and my parents, and how did they cope with challenging times? And let's look historically and look to our elders and their strategies. Another one, and I don't know if you were going to get to hope at some other time, but another one is a kind of robust critique of hope.
Thank you. Yeah.
Which is that, I think a lot of people, and I have this conversation a lot with people where they think, why would me riding my bike or not using straws make a difference? It's not going to make a difference. The sense of the scale of one person's lifestyle changes not being matched to the scale of the problem, and it feels very futile. And I think we need to think differently about the reason why we get involved in actions. And social movements can teach us that the kind of instrumentalism around our actions, the sort of expectation that we're going to see immediate results, that we're going to have, we're going to make a big sacrifice and we're going to see immediate results happen, or that we need to see the results to recharge our desire to do that work, that is really dangerous, and that will undermine us and we'll give up right away. And so the folks who I'm thinking about talk a lot about a kind of hope that isn't so instrumental, that doesn't require evidence to prove that your actions are resulting in these kinds of results, right? And so social movements can really teach us different emotions that we need to be, deploying and using strategically, and how to deal with grief and how to get up and still be resilient in the face of a lot of evidence against you. And they also, social movements have the other effect of really, social movements have never had a problem thinking seriously about emotion and the role of emotion in advocacy. And so that's something that was a real epiphany for me when I read Edward Murray Brown and started reading some of these more social movement theory, that environmental studies educators and educators in general in higher education, we think of young people as leaving their hearts at the door and only bringing in their heads. And social movements know that engaged long-term advocacy needs the heart, hand, and the head. You need action, you need feelings, you need your sort of soul and spirit and feelings, and you also need cognitive analysis and skills. And so that sort of trilogy of all three different modes of being have been completely ignored by higher education in general, and from the climate movement as well.
Why do you think it's been so ignored by higher education?
Well, because people with PhDs in environmental studies don't want to mess around with emotions, because that's something that happens in counseling and psychological services, right? I mean, there's the sense of that's messy stuff, and that's not what I got my degree in. I mean, the skills that are required to do this kind of work is a different skill set than understanding carbon cycles. I mean, there's a different skill set, and it's understandable that faculty think of that as compartmentalized, right? That by the time students are in college, they should have the emotional maturity to know how to deal with their emotional lives, and it's not what's happening in the classroom.
Mm. Okay, so this might be a tough question. I don't know, but I wanted to ask you, how does all of this like climate anxiety affect you personally? And what are the ways that you experience climate anxiety, and maybe some personal strategies that you've found some of the smaller strategies in your daily life that you do to cope with it?
Yeah, that's such a great question. It is. People don't actually ask me that question very often. You'd think they would, but I don't really like that question. It's true. Too vulnerable, too intimate. But that's actually a strategy, right? I mean, you have to get real with the grief and the sadness. And I think when I'm sitting around not feeling good and I'm wondering, why am I not feeling good? One of the strategies I argue in the book, and had to learn myself recently, is that you really do need to sort of stop what you're doing and focus in on this negative feeling instead of constantly trying to distract yourself. Okay, I'm going to get my phone out and scroll something, or I'm going to eat something, or this sort of distraction culture that we're in around negative feelings. And so I love the research I did on affect and the ways that Americans in particular, with their fetish around happiness and the pursuit of happiness, we're not comfortable with bad feelings. And so spending the time to figure out the source of our bad feelings and to figure out what the courses of action might be to do around that has been a really huge strategy for me. And I outline it quite a lot in the book, but it's a new strategy for me. And I got a lot of this from diving really into mindfulness studies, mindfulness work, and even sort of Buddhism. And that's, for me personally, been one of the best things that I've been able to do and increase, not as much as I'd like, but start a real mindfulness and even meditation practice to get me through all of this stuff. Every single day, probably, I have to really focus on what's going well and what I'm grateful for. So the gratitude practice, but sometimes the gratitude practice feels a little bit corny and doesn't work for me. And so instead I have a different type of strategy, which I call grounding questions, which is I think about what it is during the day to day that I'm going to look forward to. I think about, is there something that's going to happen today that is really mundane and boring that I can imbue with a little sort of sacredness or meaning or value in some way? Is there something, can I just focus on what's really, really simple and what's right in front of me and be more present so that I can enjoy a smell or a sound a little bit more intensely, just so I can stop. And that's the way I can distract myself from the negative feelings. It's more of a balm from the negative feelings. And so there's, all kinds of sort of psychological stuff, mindfulness stuff, Buddhism stuff, gratitude practice things, and of course scholarship. I mean, I'm academic, so scholarship is like therapy to me, and reading these books on how we're going to get through these problems has been a real support for me too.
Wow. And so hopefully mindfulness is something we should all be practicing more, I think. But I mean, some people might, I don't know, hearing Buddhism or, they might think it's a little bit out there for them. Do you experience some of that resistance or, from students, from academics, the scientist types?
Yeah, I have to confess, no. No, I don't. But part of it is because I'm the one who seems to be late to come to it, maybe. Many of the folks who are in my field, so I'm actually in the environmental humanities. So I have a training in eco-criticism or environmental literary criticism, which is a pretty narrow subfield of environmental studies. And it's a really uncommon one. It's not the one people think of when they think of environmental work. And so, and I actually have my bachelor's degree in religious studies. So I have a humanities, my strain is in the humanities, and many people in the humanities have been combining these ways of thinking and have been pushing me to integrate contemplative practices in my own pedagogy, not to mention my own life. And so there's a real kind of movement in the field to be thinking about these kinds of things. And this is this particular book around existential strategies for young people has been one of the few times ever that environmental scientists have reached across the table and wanted to talk about it. And so I find that pretty exciting. So no, I don't get a lot of resistance, but
it's then not again, just the Humboldt County. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I just did an international existential toolkit for educators workshop with people from about 30 different countries, all with huge amounts of skill sets around this that I was learning from like a fire hose. And, people are doing this. It's pretty amazing. I mean, I think we're in a zeitgeist moment of crisis, and coronavirus is really bringing it to a head. And people who study climate change know that this is how it's going to be. This is how people are going to start caring about climate change, and when they feel it this way, and when the whole world starts to go topsy-turvy. And the emotional and sort of spiritual preparation for that is going to be pretty epic. And I'm thinking about here, Jem Bendham's deep adaptation work, and there's lots of folks who have kind of jumped ship from the sciences to move into the existential realm, to face what's coming, are prepared for this.
So we're talking about, reaching people who are involved in activism mostly, who already are concerned about climate change and, experiencing a lot of climate anxiety. But what do you say in terms of like being able to reach across to people who maybe, ascribe to climate denying, or they don't really think it's that serious, the kind of people that, which is a shrinking population in America, really, the people who don't think it's serious. But, for those people, how can activists, and people who care about this issue communicate effectively?
That was such a great question. That was one of the questions I spent a lot of time in my book thinking through. There's a chapter called Be Less Right and More in Relation. And I was really trying to puzzle over this question. And so there's a couple of strategies. I'm really moved by Katharine Hayhoe's work on this. Katharine Hayhoe is a climate scientist / evangelical. So she's bridging worlds. And her argument is to listen to what it is that concerns people instead of trying to press your concerns and get people to come around to your concerns. And listening to what concerns people and then helping them connect the dots to climate change is one important strategy. And I think of that as curious, compassionate conversation. In my book, I have an assignment I even give students around this. But another point there is that it's pretty understandable why people don't want to care about climate change. And this is where I'm drawing on folks like Per Espen-Stokes and Kari Norgaard, sort of environmental sociologists and psychologists who talk about apocalypse fatigue, and they talk about the sort of main reasons using risk perception theory, why people can't perceive climate change as a risk. And there's all kinds of reasons why climate change is not really a perceivable risk. And so it's understandable that people don't get mobilized around it. And so reframing climate change in a way that taps into the things that people perceive as risks, like health, is one of the strategies that we can use. So those are two, sort of a curious listening and trying to connect the dots, and then also thinking about reframing a little bit. There's so much good research on this around why it is that, how it is that climate change has become a partisan issue, and that this has to do with the messenger more than it has to do with the science or the validity of the argument. And so if people are more likely to change their behavior and their values if their neighbors are doing it, or if the people that they trust or listening to on the radio are advocating for it. We've seen this happen with the mask issue right now, right? What are my neighbors doing? What are my people I'm listening to doing? And I'll do that, right? So this is less about science and more about the messenger. And so we're thinking about how do we get the right messenger to communicate these values, instead of saying, hey, I'm a coastal elite and I care about climate change, and why aren't you, catching up to the science, you dum-dums, right? Which
is why Katharine is such an effective communicator on this, right?
Right. And so those are just a few strategies, but I mean, it doesn't take much digging into the psychology of behavior change to figure out that the dominant mode of kind of being louder and sort of arguing your point more firmly doesn't work. And again, that was one of the big epiphanies I had teaching, that just teaching my students to argue their point more wasn't actually going to achieve what we needed to be achieving. So I had to undo all of that learning myself.
Well, I suppose we should turn to some audience questions. We have a couple here. So John asks, your book is directed towards younger people. What advice do you have for boomers who are concerned and want to help this movement?
That is a great question. And it's interesting because boomers seem to be the ones who are, I'm between Gen Z and boomers. And so my technology is maybe more boomer friendly. So the way that I'm communicating the message seems to be being received by boomers. And I love it. Well, the intergenerational dimension, right? And not being condescending. So those are super important. And one of the reasons why I wrote this book is for audiences like boomers to kind of translate what this generation is about to boomers. So there's a little bit more empathy and patience and kind of tools to communicate with this generation, because there's so much energy there. And so some of the advice I have to give is the argument that they ought to wake up and care about this stuff and do more stuff about it and put away their phones and that kind of thing, which is oftentimes what I hear, right? Is really rubs wrong, because this is a generation who's doing things like, for the first time ever, not thinking they're going to have a retirement, that there's going to be capitalism, that they're going to have children and do all the life course things that their parents and grandparents did. I mean, they're really faced with the potential of a very uncertain future. And so that kind of sympathy would be really helpful. And then, to not kick into the resentment thing by saying, why don't you fix these problems, young people, right? So the other argument that young people hear a lot from boomers and people from my generation is, this is the problem that you're going to have to solve. I did my best, and, good luck to you. And that, given the fact that boomers are often cited as the sort of people who have gained the most from the extraction economy and who are now passing that on, externalizing the cost of that to this generation, that feels really hurtful, right? Really hypocritical and really hurtful. And so there's this sort of sensitivity around how the narratives are unfolding for this generation about what the boomers have left for them is really an important one. The other thing is that boomers tend to be more concerned about environmental problems if it has to do with their grandchildren or their retirement, their money. And so if there are some strategies that boomers can give to young people to get boomers to care more about it around the things that are reflective of that set of concerns, that is really good coalition building, I think.
Oh, wonderful, thanks. Gary asks, how can we envision a sustainable future when so many scientists say that we are past the tipping point now?
Yeah. Yeah. So, well, like social movements have taught us, the evidence pointing to things being really, really bad will result in people not engaging in the work to try to manifest something better. And every little bit does count. And I'm not just, there's actual, like, I've read about this a lot, and there's people who can draw the points together and say, here's how it does count. And we want to dampen that effect. So the tipping point argument kind of has this all or nothing, black and white thing go on, like, well, it's inevitable anyway, so let's just whatever. That is actually not what scientists argue. Every little bit that we cut back will reduce the severity of the impacts. And, there's that wonderful flatten the curve of climate change, like we flattened the curve of coronavirus, meme that went around. And I really love that, because like, yes, let's like pull back. Every little bit that we pull back will have less impact in the future. And this, going back to the science, the psychology of this, if people don't think that they can manifest the future that they want to live in, they're not going to try. And so simply because we need people to engage, and because the option is nihilism, we might as well try to desire the future. So what are the other options? Yeah, sure, tipping points, sure, sustainable. The evidence that we're going to have a sustainable future seems really grim right now, but the alternative is to not do anything, and that doesn't seem good either. And if we can live in a different story just so that we can keep waking up and do the work, that is strategic. It doesn't have to be necessarily true, but it is very emotionally strategic. And the choice to not live in that story really is very unpleasant. Really, we might as well just throw our hands up and give up. And so it's not about, if we spend too much time focusing on the future that we fear instead of the future we desire, it'll become a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yes, I mean, I keep thinking about what these goals that we have from the Paris Climate Agreement. The nations agreed in 2015. We, at the very least, we have to stop the temperature from rising above 2 degrees Celsius, right? Because after that point, there's a lot of uncertainty, and we hope we don't get to that point. But let's aim for 1.5 degrees. Let's see if we can make that target. And there's a huge difference in terms of like the consequences potentially between those two. But it sounds like what you're saying is we have to think about the risks, but also the future, the positive, desirable future that we want to see.
Yeah, and I think especially for young people, that tipping point argument or the 2 degrees argument or those kinds of big technological and political challenges feel insurmountable. And we already have been taught by most of society, and especially in American capitalist society, that we don't have any power as individuals. And the only way we have power as individuals is if we have a lot of money. And so we can buy our way out of it, right? And I think young people need to have a much wider, broader sense of their power, their efficacy, their many spheres of influence that aren't just about whether you have a lot of money power, because that's just a consumer model. And we've been really deprived of a larger sense of ourselves as actors in society, as citizens, as family members, as mentors, as all kinds of other things that young people are already doing. And they just don't see themselves as having power. And so the illusion of powerlessness is a real dangerous thing. And whatever we can do to make young people think that they have the power to manifest a world that they want to live in, the more likely it is that they are going to do that, even if it's just on a small scale, right? So even if it means they end up just like creating an intentional living community and reducing something in their scale, well, this has the effect of rippling out. And this goes back to Adrienne Brown's work on emergent strategy. The emergent aspect of that strategy is that it ripples out.
Well, this question that from Mary seems to kind of connect to what you were just saying. Have you had any students from communities affected by climate change now, and do their emotions differ from students from more affluent communities?
That is a very good question, and the answer is an absolute yes. So I think there was a time when environmental studies students, so the CSU that I work in, the Cal State system, is not a very affluent system to begin with. And I worked also at an institution in Alaska that's a public enrollment institution. So my students, I wouldn't say are privileged relative to lots of college students in that sense. But even then, environmental studies used to attract more of a white, somewhat more privileged demographic of students. And the dominant emotion that they were having when they would learn these things was kind of disillusionment and really a sense of their pervasive complicity in all of the problems. And so guilt was kind of the main thing. And I called it kind of eco white fragility, right? There's a sort of white fragility thing, but there's a green white fragility. That's a different thing, right? Similar,
Yes.
but different.
It connects with so much that we're talking about these days.
It connects with so much what we're talking about. It's really using the analyses of racial justice and racial scholars, race study scholars, to think about environmentalism as a form of whiteness, right? Yeah. But to go to the question of, is it different for people who are experiencing it? Absolutely. And so increasingly the field, because people are increasingly feeling it on the front lines, and because higher education, especially in California, is getting increasingly more diverse. We are now at our campus, we're a Hispanic or minority serving institution, which means that we have over a certain percent who claim themselves as Hispanic. So increasingly, this means that environmental studies classes are getting more diverse for a variety of reasons. And the affect is very different. The emotional response to this material is very different, because what they're reading about and learning about is their communities now. It's not just some other community. And so that's a very different set of emotions. And there's a sense of centering their experience, which is great, but there's also a sense of the analysis going on here doesn't resonate with my truth, right? Or there's a lot of different things that go on with that. And there's new pedagogy and new advice and new strategies that educators need to be using in the environmental field to make sure that that's happening effectively.
I mean, I can imagine that, it's the health impacts aren't just theoretical for the people the kids who grew up, cited in like pollution, throwaway zones, where, rates of asthma are so much higher. And of course, that even connects to now when COVID is, the air pollution impacts that they've been experiencing their whole lives are creating much greater rates of COVID mortality in Black and Latinx communities.
Yeah, and that's really true. And when you realize that if you assume that your students are white privileged environmentalists, that just recenters the white experience again, right?
Yeah.
And so, in fact, coming to environmental education with trauma-informed pedagogy, for example, when you assume your students are experiencing trauma of some kind, whether it's displacement or intergenerational trauma or sexualized violence or police brutality or climate trauma, then you have a very different set of approaches and obligations to those students. And so I think environmental educators are increasingly getting trained in that kind of pedagogy.
I can imagine that reaching out to colleagues who understand those issues and how to talk about that, and the students themselves who are experiencing that like hearing from them what's going on, that must be really helpful to you.
Yep, those are all great strategies. And since I had come from an humanities background where I had studied things like feminist theory and postcolonial theory and race ethnic studies, and was really immersed in my undergrad and my master's, that it seems so strange to me that the environmental field is so slow to come to this. But of course, there's reasons for that. And so, but they are, and it's happening, and the younger generation, like I said, because they see these things as connected, are really pushing that. Right? They're demanding it. They're holding. We had this. There was that. STEM lockdown. I can't remember what it was called. It was hashtag. There was sort of like a critique of STEM that was happening right after where we were in the middle of the protests around trying to hold STEM accountable, science, technology, engineering, math, that those fields accountable for the kind of racial politics of the way they teach those fields. And so environmental sciences is often clustered into that group. And people who are studying environmental issues from a race lens are really changing the ways that we teach that kind of stuff.
So we touched on this a little earlier, but I wanted to ask you this question, about COVID, the stuff that's going on right now in the world, all of this anxiety-inducing stuff, COVID-19 to continued police brutality against Black Americans. So to what extent, what kinds of strategies can you talk about that you offer for coping with climate anxiety? How can they help people address other sources of anxiety in their lives right now? And I mean, these are synergistic too, right? They're all happening at the same time.
Yeah, and I want to just step back a bit to think about something you alluded to earlier about the race of asthma. And one of the things that we can be doing, maybe it's a strategy for coping with anxiety, but it's also, like I said, kind of this analysis therapy, right? That seeing the ways that climate change is going to be unevenly experienced by vulnerable populations that have been historically treated as disposable by dominant systems of colonialism and capitalism. Those populations are the exact same ones that are experiencing the worst effects of COVID, and for the exact same reasons in many cases. And so what I think is what's happening now in a moment of COVID and protests is that we're laying bare the structural inequalities that create so-called underlying conditions of vulnerability that are not biological or genetic. They're environmental, they're economic, they have to do with power and politics, and they're things that we can change. And so we can't change our genetic makeup, but we can change how zip codes are treated. So there's I think a real analysis emerging, connecting things like the slow violence of climate change and environmental siting of toxins in certain neighborhoods, and fast violence or obvious violence, like something like police brutality. And I'm thinking of the work here of folks like Julie Z and Lindsay Dillon, who are talking about how the statement "I can't breathe" is both an indictment of long-standing environmental racism and also of the structures of racism within the police system and the incarceration system. And I think we need to do more coalition building with those folks. So that's just the analysis I feel like I want to make sure we're bringing to the table. But the strategies for anxiety, they're going to be different for different people. Everyone's going to respond differently. And I think that I want to make it really clear that some folks are, severely experiencing actual clinical depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation. And this book, or my ideas right here, are no substitute for professional help. So I want to say this is not just, this is just a Band-Aid for some anxiety. The deep anxiety needs serious help. But for me, the strategies that have been working for me have been really about building community, finding it in kind of lots of different places and contributing to it so it can fuel me when I'm feeling low. When we have a community of people we know are working on this stuff, when we need a break, we can feel okay about taking a break and taking care of ourselves. It's really evident to me that self-care is a form of political resistance. And I used to really think of them as kind of in conflict with each other until I saw, Audre Lorde's beautiful statement that self-care is an act of it's not just an act of self-preservation, it's political resistance. And I really build on that idea of how preserving ourselves and preserving the kinds of feelings in life that we want to live is in itself a form of political resistance. in the book. That's something that I think is really important to me. When I
It's hard
feel,
for people to accept. Sorry to interrupt, but it's
yeah, yeah,
hard for people to accept, like you write, that it's hard to get yourself to believe, like really, like helping myself is going to help the movement too.
yeah. And the planet, the planet and our fellows, fellow neighbors on this planet need us to take that. And so you asked some of the strategies. I think writing grounding questions and kind of doing it on a daily basis is really helpful for me. And taking there's a strategy. I spent a whole chapter in the book called Hack the Story. And I think one of the things that we really need to do is be conscientious about the media that we consume. And I mean this because something like 85% of media messages around climate change are framed in the negative frame, like this is a bad thing that's happening, which isn't to say that that's wrong. But when you combine that with the negativity bias in our reptilian brains that focuses on, scanning the horizon for the next threat, we are more focused on the negative anyway. We have a negativity bias. And so this is a kind of a perfect storm of to have us feel like we're living in a world that's going to what, and so we really need to actively counterbalance that, not because we don't want to live in truth, but because in fact there is a lot of other good truth going on, and operating from more of a place of some of those positive truths and kind of gravitating towards those positive truths is going to refuel us and make us probably contribute to making that positive world happen even further. Another strategy that's really important is you got to figure out what your superpower is, And so in the chapter called Claim Your Calling and Scale Your Action, I say, you can't imagine yourself toppling all of the systems tomorrow. It's not going to happen. So what is your sort of superpower? And do it every day, do a little bit of it every day, and be okay that's your contribution for the day. And so there's a sense of, I have to do all of this by tomorrow that is really undermining. So strategies around media, how we treat media and how we analyze media. This is where I think discourse analysis or some sort of media literacy is really important for how we're consuming these stories and what the effect is on us. And really thinking about, what our superpower is and manifesting it and acting on it on a daily basis. So that's kind of COVID too, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly a fan of the work of the Solutions Journalism Network. They help reporters all over the country actually think of, stories and produce stories just about those solutions-oriented, ideas that you're talking about. That's not just these depressing stories all the time.
Yeah, and there's evidence that shows that if you think that you're part of a collective of people who are doing this all around the world, you are more likely to continue doing it. So why not focus on some of those? It's not false. It's not Pollyanna. It's not like we're intelligent enough to be able to hold two truths in our minds at the same time, that the world has a lot of problems and it also has a lot of good things. Both of these things are true. And so that's one of those somewhat Buddhist, but also just sort of, basic scholarship of psychology that there are many truths that are operating. And what our challenge is to figure out how it is that we can consume the truths in a way that enable us to continue to do the work.
Well, we're just about almost out of time, but I did have one more question for you, Sarah. And my question is, what's next for you? What are you looking at on the horizon? I mean, it's such a hard time to plan for the future, but are you thinking about that? What are you thinking about now?
Gosh, that is a good question. You're right that the future feels really close all of a sudden, and it's hard to plan past the next meal. Yeah, and I hadn't really thought of that. But if I can sort of imagine operating from a place of that story I want to live in, I imagine that what's happening with COVID and the protests is going to have a lot of things reorganized. There's going to be a lot of new social arrangements, family relationships, networks of kin and care, all different kinds of things are going to be reorganized in the upcoming, I don't know, 5 or 10 years. And I really like the idea of contributing to that, bolstering young people to tell them that this is a good time to be doing it. Everything's not solid now, time to remake society. And I really want to push that we rebuild post-COVID, post-protests in a way that is climate friendly, because this is the time to be doing that. And of course, climate change is only going to exacerbate issues of inequality and, pandemics effects of pandemic. So I think this is a real moment that we can really push for that argument and push for that to happen. And so I'm happy about that. And I am trying to, on a more local level, I'm going to try to, on my own campus, start to build out a certificate on climate justice leadership that integrates a lot of these ideas. And I've kind of, for better or for worse, sort of dropped everything I used to be doing, and I'm just sort of completely invested in these topics now and thinking about how to use the psychology of emotion to organize better, to work harder on the stuff, to resource ourselves, to feel good about the world we live in. So that's fun. I mean, when you're doing that with young people, it's fun. So I want to keep doing that.
That's great. I look forward to seeing what you do in this movement. Actually, we do have one more question from Paul that seems just perfect to ask. He says, between COVID-19 issues around race and the current political state, do you see climate change being lost in the noise?
Yeah, I mean, possibly, right? But there are so many people making these connections. And again, oftentimes they're young people. And so the accountability that's happening, we see AOC doing this, we see Greta Thunberg doing it, we see it across, races and different positionalities of privilege. And there is a kind of unified voice around all of this stuff is going to be made worse by climate change. So as we rethink these systems, we need to be focusing on that. I actually think it's going to take more of a center stage than it ever has before, in part because it was already on the way to being doing that. In 2018-19, there was more attention to climate change than we've ever had. So that's pretty exciting. And if we can just successfully connect the dots between what's happening with the protests and COVID with climate change, which I think young people are doing, we are going to have a very different political and even maybe economic landscape ahead of us, I hope.
Wow. It's a great note to end on. So I need to put a goodbye on here, of course. Sarah Jaquette Ray is the author of A Field Guide to Climate Anxiety, How to Keep Your Cool on a Warming Planet. Sarah, thanks so much for joining us today.
It was really my pleasure. Thank you so much, and stay safe.
You too. I hope we all do. A big thank you, of course, to everyone who joined our event tonight. Living on Earth is listener supported, so if you would like to pitch in what you can to support events like this one, please go to our website, loe.org, and make a donation. $5 or any amount that feels right to you. That's loe.org. And of course, I have to recommend most highly A Field Guide to Climate Anxiety. This is the book. Find it at your local bookstore, I suppose. We'll be having many more events like this. So please follow our Facebook and our Twitter. We're at Living on Earth, and we're on Instagram at Living on Earth Radio. Stay tuned, everybody. Stay safe, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.